Hello everyone, Małgorzata Bonikowska, the Center for International Relations and the Think Tank Institute. Today we have a book talk in English, as you can see. Welcome to all of you who watch us regularly, and we try to encourage all of you to read books. So please just read our quarterly book review. And today we have a very special book talk and a special guest, Lady Catherine Ashton. Hello, good morning, Cathy.
Good morning, how are you? Good to see you.
Good to see you again. You've just had a great trip to Poland with some lectures and meetings around your book, and that's why we discuss today this book. To all of you, we strongly recommend it because it's really, really unique, just published in the UK, so not available in Polish, but absolutely available online. And then what? The stories about 21st century diplomacy. Lady Ashton wrote it just recently. Let me just, Cathy, say a few words about you. You don't need much introduction to all the EU experts, but maybe not everyone remembers that you are, first of all, the British politician in House of Lords. It has been over 2 decades. Of course, in the EU, you were remembered for being a commissioner for trade, but especially for being first high representative for foreign and security policy, and actually the person who physically created for European External Action Service, meaning European diplomacy. So congratulations, this was really tough.
It was, no question, trying to set up the service while doing all of the work that was required. I said it was like flying a plane and putting the wings on at the same time.
And you wrote also in your book that this was just one sentence mentioning the treaty about External Action Service, nothing much more.
Yes. It said in the treaty, the High Representative shall be assisted by or supported by an External Action Service, full stop. And so from that, we had to create a whole diplomatic service, you know, all of the layers, work with the member states, work with the institutions and with the parliament to create something that would be unique. And as I always say to people, you know, you go into the Spanish embassy or the Polish embassy or the British embassy, the German embassy, when you arrive, you know which country you're in, you can tell. So how would you know that you were in Europe? And it wouldn't be the art on the wall or the rugs on the floor. It would be something about the way Europe was and the way that people, diplomats, work together, and the fact that the team would have representatives from lots of different European countries. But it was the big challenge. How do you know you're in Europe?
Well, it still is, but at least we've started this process, which maybe will take years for us to really build this European diplomacy. But you were the first, and unfortunately, then your country left the EU. So that's all about the UK now, that we can say we regret that the UK is now out of the EU, but we have still 27 EU member states and 27 ministers of foreign affairs and 27 diplomacies. And in the middle of this, we have the EU minister, high representative, now is Josep Borrell, but it was you who started this path. So this book, if I may ask you directly, because the title is quite interesting, and then what? What does this mean, this title? What did you want to say?
Very simply, when I was in office, you know, we were dealing with lots of different crises or issues, and we would try and work out what we should do. And officials would sit with me or ministers would sit with me and we'd say, well, we should do this. We should, you know, try and help people in this particular way. And I always asked the question when I could, and then what? Because we all know, all of the people who look at foreign policy, look at development, look at defense security policies, know that it's not enough to think about the first step. It's important to think what next. And you don't know quite what's going to happen when you take a course of action, when you decide to do something. You can't be certain where it will go. But I always believe you need to ask the next question, which is, okay, and then what? And so that became the obvious title for the book.
Well, we strongly recommend to read this book, even if it's not yet in Polish, but it is very, very unique because it's really an inside look into the most interesting negotiations in our century, actually. Really, the challenges we still have, that's what also you say very often, that these issues remain with us. So tell us, please, what can we find in your book?
So what I've done is tell 7 stories. I want you to come with me into the room, to the place where I'm visiting, and to see through my eyes, but also alongside me to see through your own eyes what we're trying to deal with. It's based on stories that I recorded at the time. My husband used to interview me when I came back from my travels, so there's quite a lot of detail that you would normally have forgotten years later.
This is very interesting. Let's stress that your husband is a really brilliant man and he's a journalist, so he knew that the value, it could be really precious years after that he recorded you at that very moment, right?
That's right. I mean, absolute credit to him, because he knew I wouldn't be able to keep a diary. I wouldn't have time. But when I came back, we didn't cover every subject, but we would take some of the main issues we were dealing with, the Iran talks, Serbia, Kosovo, what was happening in the Arab Spring and so on. And I would just talk. And of course, it's fantastic when you later transcribe it. I transcribe them, type them up. You hear your own voice, you hear your anger or how fed up you are or how pleased you are kind of comes through as well. So it was really interesting for me to look at these stories and to write them down. People often had asked me about what was it like to be in Maidan in 2013? What was it like to be standing in Tahrir Square during the crisis in Egypt, the dramatic changes? What was it like to see the aftermath of an earthquake? And so I was able to kind of bring people with me and hopefully show them in the stories what it's like, and then what we're trying to do and how successful we were or we weren't in dealing with the issues as they presented themselves.
So number one, you will find this book a lot of details, inside stories. It's like really being together with Lady Ashton in the room and listening to all these people, following the negotiations going on. I myself was really amazed that you put so many details, which is absolutely fabulous for everyone who is interested in history and political science and current issues. Because not all of us, most of us don't have really any access to this internal world of politics and diplomacy. That's number one. And number two is that you describe really the most important talks, which still influence our current situations. Let me take an example of negotiations with Iran concerning nuclear deal. If you can just mention a little bit, maybe just to encourage our readers to have a look more in details in the book, what they can expect. How did you do it? 4.5 years, a long time in your life.
So one of the things that's been interesting are people that worked with me have been reading the book and coming back and saying, gosh, I remember it now. It was like yesterday. It was like going back in time, and could remember the kind of ups and downs of the challenge of trying to get the talks to work. So on the Iran talks in particular, what I'm describing are 6 countries, Russia, China, America, France, Britain, Germany, senior people from each working under my chairmanship, trying to develop a common reason, a common set of ideas that they would stick to in order to present those to Iran, to be our negotiating position, and then to take you through what it's like to sit down and actually have the dialogue with, in this case, the Iranian team. So it's really making it feel real, I hope, to people, because what you're listening to is a dialogue that really happened. What you're understanding are the things that go wrong, because these are very human stories as well. They are about what happens to human beings in all sorts of circumstances. And top-level negotiations, it is no different to anything else. things go wrong, mistakes get made, things happen. And I tell a very particular story of trying to work out how to bring together the talks properly in order to get to an answer. And then, of course, the human nature kind of kicks in and something happens that goes wrong. So they're real life stories about real life people in really difficult circumstances, and show, I hope, how it feels to be an ordinary person in extraordinary circumstances trying to work out what to do.
But it's also interesting to remember that all these negotiations, it's just people who talk. They're really, the human aspect is so important. And in the case of Iran, it's also this intercultural relation, which is kind of a challenge also for a person coming from Europe to talk to Iran, which is a different culture, different habits, different maybe methods of even treating women. And you are a woman, you were a woman negotiator in Arab world. How was it?
So it's interesting, because I never really felt that was a big issue. I think with the Iranians, women in Iran are highly educated, run businesses, take part in all kinds of aspects of life, except politics, really, at the senior level anyway. And so the team I was working with, and though they were all men, though I did meet the vice president who came a couple of times, though they may have been men, but their partners, if they were married, their wives were actually professors and very senior people. So that was not an issue. Being British, more of a challenge to begin with, because Britain's relationship with Iran was not easy. But I found within a very short period of time that we had established enough of a rapport that I think we were able to talk to each other pretty openly. And that's about the great diplomatic skill of all, really, which is listening. Listening, and more than listening, hearing what they want to tell you, which is sometimes what happens in between the words, in the gaps between the words. You kind of get a sense of what people are trying to say to you. And so in all of the stories that I tell of different challenges, I think what I'm also trying to show is that it's not easy. It's ordinary people trying to get things right. And there are skills that some people have that have really helped them. Great diplomats that I met will always say to you that listening is a big skill.
Well, this is also another reason to really read this book for those who are interested in negotiations, not only in diplomacy, politics, international relations, but also in business or in everyday life. It's a lot of lessons Kati is giving us, and suggestions and reflections, what you yourself was thinking about, and the methods you were using, and what was, right, what was wrong. I just wanted to ask you how you felt when all these almost 5 years was, just canceled in 5 minutes by President Donald Trump.
It was not a great day. I think what it showed, though, is the thing that perhaps I took away from all this is that you have to look after whatever it is you've achieved. There is a long-term element to everything that we do in foreign policy, development, diplomacy, because it's not enough to solve a problem immediately, or at least to try. It is all about how far you're prepared to commit to the future of that country, those people, that situation. And in the context of the Iran talks, in a way, we didn't look after the deal well enough. We didn't make it so nailed down, so clearly part of the landscape of foreign policy and diplomacy, that it could be knocked around by the political changes in one country. And that, I think, says a lot about the role of the UN Security Council, because that was where it came from, the role of the other countries, but also the role of trying to manage politics domestically. So big lesson for all of us is it's not enough just to do the deal, it's hanging on to it and making sure that you look after it into the long term.
Right. You also, very often say that most of these challenges we still have. So the negotiations is not just like, process, it finishes one day. It's maybe, takes years and years really to conclude something stable. So I want to ask you in this regard about, of course, Russia and Ukraine, because that's something which in Poland right now, it's really one of the most important topics we all are discussing. You were one of these politicians who went to Ukraine when Maidan started. What were your feelings? Don't tell us everything which is in the book, but definitely in the book, all the readers will find the details, but tell us a little bit more what you found there.
It was extraordinary going to those early Maidan demonstrations. This is November in Poland. The weather is cold. It was a very, very cold part of the year, minus 30 degrees the first night, I think. And Maidan was full of people with EU flags, people from every walk of life. There were families, there were journalists, there were NGO people, there were academics, there were people from all over Kyiv, all over the country who'd come together, not just there, but in other squares too. They'd come together because they had been promised by President Yanukovych, as part of his determination to be re-elected, that he would fulfill his obligation to sign an agreement with the European Union. This wasn't membership. This was about trade and investment, opportunity, about ways for the country to develop and grow and to develop its institutions. And Poland knows very well from being part of the EU that there are opportunities. There are opportunities for investment and trade that help to grow the economy and provide opportunity for young people to travel, to study, and so on. Lots of different aspects of life. Well, this wasn't membership, but it was a strong agreement. And people felt very strongly. That's why they stood in the middle of the night. So for me, from that very first moment, you could feel that there was a determination in Ukraine that they were going to choose their own future, and it was going to be a future for them that enabled them to have the things that they wanted, to be full of opportunity in the future, and that meant an agreement with the EU. And I never forgot it, and as I say, the book describes what happened next.
And if you can just make a short comparison between the scale of difficulty, the challenge between the talks you had in Iran, or the talks you had in Somalia, or the talks you had even, around Arab Spring, and the talks with the Russians. Can you somehow compare it?
One of the things that matters when you've got negotiations is a feeling that the other side is looking for an agreement, even if they are a million miles away from where you are in their thinking. You're kind of looking for those moments where you think, yeah, there is something here. And the challenge when I met with President Putin or with Sergei Lavrov to talk about Ukraine was, they're not interested in what Ukraine wants. They were interested in what was good for Russia as they saw it, not as you or I might see it, in terms of being a good neighbor and a good friend to Ukraine and a good partner in Europe in trade and so on. They're not interested in that. What they're interested in is, what is the opportunity for Russia? And so they approached it only from that point of view.
Well, indeed, that's the challenge for all of us, how to handle Russia. And that's the challenge for the EU diplomacy as well. We are living now in the time where the West is really united. It's very impressive. But how difficult it is to take decisions as, the EU 20, well, in your case, 28 even countries before Brexit happened. That's something, by the way, another reason why we recommend to read this book. It's a lot about European diplomacy. It's a lot about the EU power in international affairs. And maybe, Kati, you can comment a little bit on how you see really this EU role in diplomacy, in foreign affairs, despite the fact we are not a state.
Well, I say a lot, and I think you've heard me say this a few times, that Brussels is unique as the only place in the world where people come knowing that their job is to find a solution together. It's not their job to stand behind their national position. They'll do it for a while, they'll be difficult, it's all very loud and open, and people argue, and it seems to take time. But the whole point about Brussels is it's where people find solutions together. And the strength of that is not to be underestimated. I used to think that Europe didn't really know how strong it really was. Biggest trade bloc in the world, the capability, if it sticks together, to be very strong, very determined, to use the value of its soft power as both a pull, countries that want to come into the EU, the Western Balkans, Ukraine, countries like Moldova, countries that have a desire to be part of it, and those who want to have a strong relationship with it. And because it has that strong power, economic and political, in my view, it needs and should use it more and more to show what it's capable of doing. So there's a lot that can be done. But as I think you said at the beginning, we're really at the beginning of European foreign policy. We're on our third High Representative, not even 15 years that we've had somebody. It'll take a while yet before we can see how strong and how valuable European diplomacy can be.
Well, we have aspirations. Definitely, we have a vision that, and we have even a name, Common European Foreign Policy. But in reality, it's really challenging to get an agreement, especially because we have to take it in, like in one voice, like one unanimously. We cannot even vote. So how do you, from your perspective, how do you see the future of this process? How can we really reach out into this moment that the capitals will kind of reduce a little bit their own individual ambitions of creating foreign policy of their own?
I think I always took the view that they were not going to reduce their own ambition, but we could make them even more ambitious by giving them something else that they could add on to. That my job was not to take away from the foreign ministers of European countries, but to add my voice to theirs and have them add their voice to mine.
But do they understand it this way? How can you explain it? I mean,
I took a lot of time to explain what my vision was, and it was that we are joined together in a common endeavor, a common attempt to make something bigger and better. And everybody wins in Europe if we do that. If we're split, if we're divided, then everybody enjoys that. The enemies enjoy that. They want to split us off. They want to make us separate from each other. They want to make us different from each other. And they will exploit that as far as they possibly can. But the strength lies in that every single country, however big, however small, can look to its colleagues, look to the others and say, will you support me in the things that matter to me? In return, I will support you. And that's when it becomes a very strong and important endeavor, exercise in European diplomacy that will become stronger and stronger over time. But it's not about taking away. And your point about unanimity, I hope that they're able to keep that at least for as long as possible, because what you don't want are countries saying, well, I didn't vote for that, so I'm not really part of that. Because what matters when you go and present what the European Union thinks to another country, especially if it's Vladimir Putin or somebody who is known to be a strong, challenging leader in their own country, but with whom you have many issues. The strength I felt was that I had 28 people behind me. They weren't in the room, but there they were. And that gives the High Representative a lot of strength, but it also gives every single one of those other ministers the capacity to go in and say, on this issue, I can speak for Europe because I know all of the other countries are with me.
Well, that's a very, very beautiful vision. I'm just wondering how it is when we are all under pressure of the situation. And of course, being 27 different countries, we confront really federal or even centralized states, such as China, such as Russia, but even the other players like Turkey, like the United States, like, they are all states, while we are a group of countries. So what could be your maybe advice, to your colleagues now in the EU? You're out of it, you finished it 2014, but you are very much into British politics, looking at what is happening within the EU. It's impressive that we are now so united. It is really impressive that the West, over 50 countries, speaks really loudly, one voice against Russia and for Ukraine. But What could be your advice in order to keep it going that way?
I think it's about two things. One is understanding the nature of these 27 countries working together. There's always an election somewhere. Finland is in the process right now of changing a government by the looks of it. And that will have some impact potentially, probably not very much on foreign policy. But there's always an election somewhere. There's always going to be a change. It is a constantly moving and changing thing. What matters is at the heart of it are the values that we hold. And even though my country is not part of it, I hope we still share the same values of democracy and freedom for people. This is why we stand as British people firmly with all of you for Ukraine's freedom and future. There's no difference between us on any of this. And I think it's about, for Europe, recognizing A, that it's got strength, B, that it's always going to be in a little bit of state of flux and change, because there'll always be elections somewhere. There'll always be coalitions in government. There'll always be things that people feel strongly or less strongly about. So it's not perfection if you want just one foreign policy model. But even where you have individual states, we know that when governments change, things can change too. The United States changed dramatically in its foreign policy between President Obama and President Trump. President Biden's gone back more to what you might call traditional foreign policy towards Europe. But we had those years when it was very different indeed, at least for some countries in Europe and certainly for the EU. So we need to recognize that that's the reality. You pull things together, there will be areas which are more difficult to deal with, but that the fundamentals remain. The strength of Europe lies in the fact that these people stand together and they resolve their problems across a table and find answers, even if sometimes it's very loud and it's very challenging to do it.
It's really an interesting point you made about this foreign policy system, that we have this unanimous approach and that you are not really in favor of voting. I'm just thinking myself, 27 countries is a big group. If we enlarge, it will be even larger. But the positive really is that we don't outvote anyone. So even the smallest countries can feel that the decision is also theirs.
Yeah.
But is it realistic, Kati? I mean, in the long run, not to really have a vote one day in the EU?
It may be totally unrealistic. I mean, I do think that as the EU gets bigger, you need to think about the institutions and how they're going to work effectively if you get to 34 countries or whatever it is, because then things start to become even more unwieldy or difficult to manage. So that's about institutions that were created for one particular framework, one particular group of countries, then being stretched and stretched to try and deal with a much bigger number. I think that needs to be thought about a lot. I'm sure people will, though I guess there'll be a reluctance to get into treaties and all the rest of it. But you can certainly do some organizational change that would be, I think, very helpful. But I suppose I still cling to the fact that on foreign and security policy, the issues are clearer. It's much easier to kind of discuss than many of the domestic issues, which do get caught up in party politics internally and changes that are going on and aspects of the economy of each country. Foreign policy is about Europe looking outwards and saying, what are the things that we have to manage? What are the things we care about? Who are we? And those things are more straightforward because they're really at the heart of why people come into the EU. There will be problems. It will not be easy. But I generally feel that if we get to the point where a country that is being particularly challenged by a problem feels that it's going to have to try and vote its way through, or on the other hand, a group of countries decide they're just not going to be prepared to engage on an issue, instead of being kind of required to engage, they can just sit back and say, well, we'll just be outvoted. I fear that that will then start to split off foreign policy. I'd like to be wrong about that, and maybe I am. But I think until we could be sure how we would make certain that every country in the EU stood together on foreign policy, I would hesitate to introduce ways in which people could avoid their responsibility.
This is definitely a discussion we will have to somehow confront, and Ukraine getting the candidate status recently, it's really a big change because it's a big country, and definitely the war changed the context of enlargement policy. So let's see how it goes. To conclude our talk, Kati, I just remind everyone that's not only the book about the European Union. It's first of all the book about negotiations, inside look, but a lot of knowledge which can be used also in private life or in the business. To conclude, Kati, what could be your suggestions, a part of foreign policy, generally, as far as negotiation process is concerned, when you have to really meet not always nice people, not always the people you really like? What is really the key to success? How would you define it?
Almost by definition, if you're negotiating, you're not negotiating with your friends. You're negotiating with people who you may not want to be in the same building as, never mind the same room or sitting across the table. But your job is to find an answer or to help them find an answer. And I think there are a number of things. I would say the most important thing about negotiation is to decide what it is you're trying to do and stick to it. In international negotiations, particularly, people always want to add important issues, but not the issue you're trying to deal with. So that's my first thing. And then I think the importance of getting to know the people that you're dealing with. I call it the warm-up. Always an opportunity before the talks, before you sit across the table cold, finding a way to warm up. So I would have dinner with the Iranian team the night before the talks, every time we met. And that meant I had an opportunity to catch up with them, to see what was going on, and also to be able to say, as we began our formal talks, thank you for dinner, and break the ice, which I think is really, really important. So those two things really matter. And I think to say to anyone who negotiates, it will always take longer than you think it's going to.
Wow.
Being prepared for that is important too.
So all the rest is not silence, as Shakespeare would say. All the rest you find in this book. Please take it into consideration, read it. It is just brand new book, February, Elliott and Thompson, the UK publisher. And Then What? Inside Stories of 21st Century Diplomacy. Lady Catherine Ashton was our guest, and she's the author of this brilliant book. Well, Kati, thank you very much, both for your time now, but also for the book and the inside view you gave to all of us. It's really great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just hope you will listen to our next book talks. Małgorzata Bonikowska, the Center for International Relations. Thank you. Goodbye.